Hi folks, Tom Affolter back again, and today we're going to talk about C#'s exception handling, and namely we'll talk about the TryCatch. And having been involved with programming for well over 30 years, I find the TryCatch an amazing opportunity. In the past, dealing with errors in older languages such as COBOL or Pascal, or even the early language of C, was much more difficult than it is today. So we're going to take a look at what the TryCatch can offer us. Some of the things I hope to cover within this section will, number one, be the understanding of why we want to use a TryCatch and how we can harness it to our benefit. Then we're going to talk a little bit about when you apply an exception handler to your application. We'll start by looking at coding just a generic TryCatch, a TryCatch that catches any error at all. We'll talk about how we identify a specific type of error that occurs or a specific type of exception handler. And then we'll further talk about how do we code for that specific type of exception handler. And then we're going to talk about handling error data that exception handler might return. Details about what caused that error to happen that we might want to harness to our advantage. We'll take a look at daisy chaining more than one exception handler together and why we might want to do it and how we do that. And at the very end, we're going to jump and take a look at how do we force our own error to occur. Perhaps it's not an error that the system would see, but it's an error that we decide based on some interaction a user might have that causes an error. We can force a particular error to occur. So let's talk first of all at some of the terminology, the geeky terms that come up. The term handling an error really simply talks about dealing with an error. If I'm going to write an error handler, as we're going to talk about in a minute, I'm going to deal with that error or a specific error that might occur. Handling an error simply is dealing with an error. The term exception is an event which occurs during your program's execution that disrupts that normal flow of the program's instructions. It's an error. That's all it is. It's an error that occurs that you anticipate occurring and you want to deal with. So the exception handler, as I mentioned a minute ago, is the code that we want to run if an error occurs. That exception handler can be a variety of things. We might want to tell the user what the error was. We might want to give contact information back. We might want to be very specific on the error itself. We decide maybe the program is going to terminate at that point. We decide what happens inside that exception handler. We can also have what's called handled and unhandled exceptions. An unhandled exception is those exceptions that happen naturally. You run your program, you get an error comes back in, and it says something like division by 0 or attempt to parse a double into an integer, some kind of error message that comes up. You allow the error message to happen and it terminates your program. That's an unhandled error. That's allowing the system to manage your error for you. Whereas you can handle the error by looking for a general or a specific error to occur, and you decide what happens when that error does occur. A handled error is one that you deal with. An unhandled error is one you don't deal with. In most cases, if you're writing a professional application, you want to handle every error that occurs. So we use the terms or the commands actually TryCatch, and most languages today will have some variation of the TryCatch. All C families languages, C# and Java use the same variation. So basically what the TryCatch says is, try this chunk of code. If any error occurs, jump down to the catch portion of this code. But if an error doesn't occur, you jump right over the catch portion of the error. Now when we start talking about try and catch, catch will let us look for specific errors if we want to. Here's a small console application that I wrote that has an error or an intentional error in it right now. First thing I do is I create an integer called int num1, and I'm going to give a value of 20 to it. Then I've created a second integer value, int num2, and I give a value of 0 to that. Now I'm taking int num1 divided by int num2, basically 20 divided by 0. You cannot divide a number by 0. It's going to give me an error when I run it. Let's take a look at that running and see what happens. Right off the bat, you'll see attempt to divide by 0 error. And at the same time, I want you to notice at the top here that it says divide by 0 exception was unhandled, which is telling me now that this is the error message that the screen would give back to me if I ran the executable. It's taken me in the debugger now because I've got Visual Studio open. But if I simply went back in and ran this directly from the executable, this message would pop up. Now, before I go on, I do want to show you one other thing, though. Because my program does not look, it's not processing at the time I'm writing my code, it doesn't know that the error occurred. But just let me show you something. If I had gone back in and instead of putting int num2 in, I put a 0 right here at that point, and I build it, I expect, I didn't get an error here. So it's still going to give me the division by 0 error. I would have expected it to come back and tell me, let me just for the heck of it try this. Oops, stop the program. Let's put a 20 in there. There we go. Now it's going to recognize that I'm doing a division by 0, and it's going to give me a syntax error before the program even runs. So let me go back to where I was before, and here's the original program. Now, in order to decide how to put a TryCatch in, I need to determine where the error occurs. So when I ran it, I know that these are pretty much error-free. I can include those in the TryCatch, but that's not where the error is going to occur. If it is going to occur at all, it's going to occur in this line right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a TryCatch. Now let me show you a nice little shortcut here. If I simply type in the word try and I hit the tab key twice, it builds me my TryCatch structure for me. So I'm going to go ahead and take this out for right now. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And now I'm going to come back and I'm going to grab that statement that's going to generate the error and I'm going to pop it right in there. Just like that. Let's format it just a little bit. And then to prove that this is working, because it's not going to do anything right now, is I'm going to put a stop right here to prove that the catch is in fact catching the error. Now keep in mind that this is a redirect. What this try code says is try this chunk of code, and when the error occurs, rather than throwing a system error as it did earlier, it's going to jump into this catch area and let me do whatever I want. So let's run it and see what happens here. In fact, let's put a stop here. Execute it. It's on that line. Let's step through it and see what happens next. Boom. It now sees the error occurs. It jumps to the catch. And then I get the throw exception. This is not going to do anything right now. It's actually going to come back and give me the error message back on the screen because I haven't done anything yet. So what are my options right now? Well, my options are to come back in here, and maybe because I'm in the console application, I can do something like a console dot write line error occurred. We'll just put error in here and a semicolon at the end. And now down below, I want to show you what's going to happen here. I'm going to put a message in here and I'm going to put done. D-O-N-E here. So when this line runs, it's going to cause an error, and that error is going to cause the error message to come up. And let's see what ends up happening with this message down below here. Let's run it. Oh, and I got nothing back. How come I got nothing back? Let's put a stop in here. Oh, because I don't have a read line at the end. So let me come back in here. My screen's closing right away, so let's do a console dot read line, and that's going to keep my screen open for me to see what the results are going to be. Let's try it one more time. Notice now what it did is it ran the error, it saw the error occurred, but then it continued running down below. That can be harnessed. We're going to talk about harness that in a minute. What I might want to do is I might want to quit the program right after the console write line error and just tell the user what the error was and then force the program to stop at that point. But again, the point being is this is a generic catch. It's going to catch any error that occurs. Let's change this around a little bit. Let's put a 1 in here and let's see what happens now when I run it. I shouldn't get an error back because in answer is 20 divided by 1, or in answer should be 20. So let's see what message pops up on the screen. Only done. And the reason is because this passed. Since it passed, didn't generate an error, it jumped past the catch, print out done, and now it's waiting for me to press any key to complete. Here's another example that I created, which is a desktop application, and this is a problem that we've experienced in the past. Let's take a look at what the program is. It's a multiplication program. I'm allowed to put in two numbers. I hit the multiply and it should give me the answer back. Let's first of all run it. Okay, so I put in 12 times 11, multiply, and the answer is 132 returned. It's a very simple program. Let's look at the code behind, and you'll see that when the button is clicked, and I left the name button 1, that I create a variable called double num1 of type double, and I'm parsing what's in that text box. Remember, to move it in to this double variable, I have to parse it. So I'm taking that text information, I'm parsing it to a double, and I'm moving it into that double precision variable. I'm doing the same thing with the second number. I'm reading it, and I'm reading it into a second double num variable. And then at the very end, I then take double num1, these double precision numbers, times double num2, get the answer for that. I then toString it, and I move it back in to the text property of the text product, which is this label right here, which should not be text product. Let me correct that. Since I'm already here, that should be label product. So let's change that to a label. And that means I got to go back into my code. Oh, look at that. I didn't know that happened automatically. When I renamed it, it renamed it in my code. That must be a new feature. Super. Now, what are the problems that could exist? Well, several problems occur, but the biggest one that comes up is, what if I forget to put anything in at all and I hit multiply? Okay, I'm going to get back an error, and it's a format exception error that says input string was not in the correct format. It's telling me now that it cannot convert an empty string into a double. Can't do that. The other error that we could get when we run it is if we try to put a letter in, like a letter R and a number letter W, multiply it. I'm going to get an error that says the same thing. String was not in the correct format. I'm trying to cast the letter R into a double. So what I want to do is I want to deal with that. I want to make it clean. I don't want the user to get that error that will come up. I have a couple of different ways I can do it. First thing is, I could surround both of these guys right here with a TryCatch, so that when either one of these guys generates an error, I put an error message up and I force them back to the form. The problem is if I do it that way, I don't know specifically which one of these generated the error. So I'm probably best off putting a TryCatch around each one of those separately. So let's try this. Let's do my try, hit my tab twice, and I'm going to move this line right here, right there, Control X, right into the try. That's the code that I want to try. Now, if that code generates an error, it's either because there is nothing in that text box or there's a letter in that text box. So I want the user to have to make that correction. So first thing I'm going to do down here is I'm going to send them a message. I'm going to do a message box.show, and I'm going to tell it in the message box, numbers only. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set focus back to that text box. Basically, by setting focus back to that text box, it's going to stop all this code from running right here. So immediately I'm going to come back and say text num1.focus. And in fact, if I'm going to do that, I probably should erase the bad information that the user put in there to begin with. The letter, I don't know if it's an empty, I don't know if it's a letter, so just in case, I'm going to delete that out. So I'm going to do text num1 dot, and I can either do a clear, and that will wipe everything out, or I can do a dot text equals and empty quotes will do the same thing. So when the error occurs, I'm going to put a message on the screen that says numbers only. Then, as soon as the user hits the OK from that, it's going to wipe out what was in that top text box, and then it's going to set focus right back into that text box again, and it will not run this information down below. Now, I do have a problem though, and the problem that I have, notice, is it's telling me that double num1 does not exist. If I point to that, it's going to say, wait a minute, whoa, 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 there is no such variable. And the reason that there's no variable is because, look at this, double num1 was declared within these brackets. That means that it ceased to exist when that bracket ended right there. So I need to make that double num1 be within focus so this guy can see it down below. To do that, I'm going to grab this guy here, I'm going to copy it, I'm going to paste right here, and I'm going to get rid of this guy. So I'm going to declare it above the statement, and I'm going to give it an initial value of 0 right off the bat. That's going to prevent some other errors that would occur, because let's see if it even gives me that here. Yeah. See, now notice what happens. I'm declaring a variable here, but because I give it no value, there is, and it's not possible, but the editor thinks it's possible to jump past this try and get down here and never have a value assigned to it. So just in case, just to get that error off, I'm going to prime it with a value of 0 initially. So now let's go ahead and run this, and I'm going to take this exception out. I don't really need this here. It's optional to put catch exception in. Whether I put the word exception in or I don't at this point, the same thing is going to happen. Let's try and run it and see. Okay. So now I'm just going to hit the multiply. Oh, it says numbers only, and it's, oh, and it did. It continued to try to run down below. So let's go ahead and correct that. So I wasn't expecting the code to continue down below. So we have 3 different options to keep our code from running below. Meaning that right now I do the numbers only message. It wipes out the text. It does set focus, but then it continues to run, which basically causes me to lose focus right here. So there's 3 different ways that we can address this. 3 different ways. The first way that comes to mind is to use a return statement right here. And return statement just basically says you're returning from this event handler, stop it at that point. That should take care of the initial problem. Let's run it and see. So I go ahead, put nothing into it, click multiply, numbers only, and I put my cursor back in, and then it allows me to continue on. If I put a number in though, I'm going to get another error. And this error is going to be from the second number down below. But let me pause and back up just a little bit and tell you a couple of different ways that we could resolve it. If we didn't want the return statement to be put in, and some programmers might feel uncomfortable with that, then what we can do is take this code right here, cut it out, and include it within the try statement. Let's try this. So now what's happening is, since this code is going to generate an error, it's going to jump down to the catch code. It's going to set focus back, but there's no code down below it to run. If this code works, it's going to continue to run. So let's go ahead and prove that that's going to work. So go ahead and click multiply, numbers only, and I put my cursor back in, and in fact it did work. So there's the second example. The third example, let me Control Z out of this. Okay. The third example would be to set up a flag. So I might create a flag here. It's going to be a Boolean. So a Boolean, a bool flag, and I'm going to call it error hit. Okay, so Boolean error hit, and I'm going to set it equal to false to begin with. There hasn't been an error yet. But if this error occurs right here, I'm going to set error hit to true right off the bat. And then down below, down here, I'm simply going to say if not error hit. If no error was hit, if not error hit, then we would then run this chunk of code. So let's take a look and see if that's going to work as well. Run it. Put nothing into it. Multiply, numbers only, and I put my cursor back in, and in fact it worked at that point. The other issue that we have, though, is that we're going to generate another error from within this guy. So this error hit method at this point may not necessarily be the best. So let's Control Z, get out of that. I want to go back to the previous examples that I had. Give me just a moment here, clean it up, get rid of that variable. And we're going to take out, let's leave the return in for right now. So that TryCatch handled only the first number, meaning that if I run this, first number is going to work fine, but now I've got to deal with the second number that generates an error. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing around this guy. I'm simply going to put a TryCatch around it. Let's stop the program. Put a try around that line. Let's take the exception handler out. We'll talk about that guy in just a minute here. Take this line right here. Cut it. Put it in the try. I'm going to grab the same exact code that we have here for the catch. Paste it right here, and now I'm going to change the variables around just a little bit. I think now, let's just double check, same problem here with num2, so I'm going to have to come up here and declare double num2 to 0 so it stays within scope. Get rid of this guy right here. And I need to take this line out because I copied it up above. And I think we should be good to go here. Let's test our application out and see if it's going to work. So first of all, numbers only. I put a 5 in there. I click multiply. Numbers only. It set me to the second one. I put a T in there, multiply, numbers only. It wiped it out. Let's put a 6 in and multiply, and now my program pretty much is running error-free. I've handled the type of errors that could occur in here. So let's go back again and review real quickly, and then we'll continue on. So in this case, I've got multiple TryCatches in here. I want to try this chunk of code right here, and I know there's a possibility of an error to come out of this. I know that if I don't put anything in the text box, it can't convert it into a double, and I know if I put a letter in, it can't convert it to a double, and that will generate an error. What's going to happen? I want to try that code, and if an error occurs, then I want to put a message box to the user saying numbers only. I want to wipe out, assuming it was the first number, I want to wipe out the text that's in that text box, and then I want to set focus right back to it, and then I want to return, which keeps it from running this line of code. There's no reason for it to put a total in there. And if that one passes, if that works, then it jumps down to the next try. Let me put a space in between here. And again, it tries the second number. And if that second number fails, and we do the same thing again. If it doesn't fail, then it makes it all the way down to put the total back in on the screen. Let's spend a couple of minutes and dive a little bit deeper into the exception handlers. So far, when I've created my TryCatches, I've tried to catch a generic error. I said, I don't care what kind of error occurs here, I want to catch any error at all. You know, when I created this, that it had this embedded in it, and I deleted it out. Again, whether I put just a standard catch in there, I put standard exception after it, they're going to do exactly the same thing. It makes no difference. But by doing this, I do have the opportunity of some additional information. Oftentimes, exception handlers will return data back to us. So if I come to the end of the statement and I put a variable in here, for example, I'm going to put EX in here, and notice it's underlined in green because it says I'm not using it yet. Right now, rather than putting in messagebox.show, I'm going to delete that out, and I'm going to put in EX dot, and one of the options I get back will be message. And that's going to give me back the original error message that was redirected. I probably don't want to use the generic error message back for a standard user, but let's talk about that in just a second, some options. Let's run this and see what that first error is going to give us back. So I put nothing in here, I click multiply, and input string was not in the correct format. That's the error message that came back to the user. So there's a lot of different potential error messages that could come back, as we're going to talk about in a minute. What I could do is I could make this a friendly type error message. Maybe I'm going to look for a term in here that I could extrapolate. Maybe the word correct format. So what I could do here is, this is going to give me back an error. So I'm going to try something here. I'm going to say if this message dot index of, and it lets me inside of here put a term in here, and the term was, and I messed that up, let me go back and generate that error again and grab that exact message that I want. Multiply. Oops. Now I'm now handling that error message because I'm doing nothing. It's actually handling the message now, so I need to comment. I want to have that error pop up. Let's try this. Let's just go back again and let's put in a, let's Control Z back to where I was. That's probably the best thing. ex.message. And we'll rerun it. Generate the error, and I'm looking for correct format. Correct format, lowercase with a period. So now, let's try that again. If dot index of, and I'm going to put in here correct format. So I'm looking for that specific term. If that is put in, if there is an index correct of, and it's greater than -1. -1 will be returned if it does not find a string correct format inside of the message. So I'm just looking for the word correct format existing in that message so that I can give the user back a better error message. And I'm assuming that there's a lot of different types of error messages that might come out. We'll take a look at an example of that in just a second here. Okay. Now, once that's done, I might do a message box dot show, and I could put anything in here. Data is incorrect. Numbers only. Pretty much the same thing I did before, but now it's looking for that specific type of error, and it's going to print it out. Now, if it generates an error that does not have correct format in there, what's going to happen is it's simply going to wipe the data out and set focus. It's not going to tell the user what kind of error it was. Although, in this particular case, it should catch it every time. Let's run it and prove that. Data is incorrect, numbers only. Data is incorrect, numbers only. So I pulled that string out. There we go. So again, I'm looking for a generic exception here when that occurs. The problem with this is, though, is it's not, well, I don't even say it's a problem. The advantage that I have is I can look for a specific error. I'm going to comment all of this out here, get rid of the TryCatch for right now, and I want to regenerate the error again. Regenerate the error. This time I want it to be system handled or unhandled. Notice right at the very top it says format exception. That is what tells me what kind of error I'm going to look for. I could have a SQL exception, a format exception, a division by zero exception if I wanted, but in this particular case I've got the input string is not in the correct format. It's a format exception. So I can now look for that specific error right here. If I put in format exception, and let's uncomment all of this. Now it's only gonna stop on this catch if it's a format exception. Any other error that might occur, which there should be none in this particular case, it will not catch it. Now it's very important to understand, though. Let me reformat this document. Let's go to Edit, Advanced, Format Document. Get everything back aligned up here. Now, it's important to understand that if I want to catch different errors, then I can daisy chain my errors together. So let me get a little more territory in here. This try says, try this chunk of code. If you generate an error, was it a format exception? If it was, deal with it here. If it wasn't a format exception, then I can do this. I can either do a standard catch here and look for another specific type of error that occurs, or I can just do a generic catch. Now it's important to put it in the order that I have it here right now. So let's just go ahead and do something, just an error message in here. It should never get to this bottom catch. I'm just going to put in here, it's a boo-boo that was made. Now here's what happens. When the error occurs, it's going to look first and say, is it a format exception error? If it's not a format exception error, it's going to jump to my generic catch and just say it was a boo-boo. That's it. If it is a format exception, it's going to do this code, and then it's going to return back up, or if there's no return statement, it's going to jump after the catch statement as it exists down below. The order is important, because if I put this generic catch above the format exception, it would always catch this error and never catch this guy. So you want to put the more specific errors up front and the less specific errors down here at the bottom. In this case, if I wanted to get the message that came back from this catch, then I could do a generic exception here, add an EX on it, and then I could at this point put an EX dot message in here to see what that message returned would be. Something like that, although I probably wouldn't want to use a capital EX here, but nonetheless, you should get the idea from this. So what did we learn out of this? Well, first thing we learned is how to look for a specific error that occurs. In this case, I'm looking for a specific format exception. How do you know which type of exception to look for? You force that exception. You make that exception occur, and it will tell you what the error is. We'll take a look at another example a little bit larger here in just a second. It's very important to note, though, what you want to do is always put your try catches at the very end of your development. You don't want to put your try catches in up front as you're developing, and the reason for that is that a try catch just right now, if I had another error that occurred in here, every error that occurs is going to be caught either with the top one or with the bottom one, no matter what the error is. And there may be some errors that occur that I'm not aware of, and I need to be aware of every possible error that could occur. So I'm going to make sure that the very last thing that I do is apply my try catches. And in fact, in a larger organization, what I would do is write my program. I would turn it over to my quality assurance, my QA testers, and I would have them test from every angle and generate every type of error that could be located, and then let me know. I then would go back in and apply my try catches to those errors. Here's an example of a application we previously created within this course, and basically what it does is it uses some ADO.NET to go back out and pull information up and populate a combo box. Let's take a look at what it's doing. So I run the application. It's right now compiling it. It's going to display it back to the screen. And let's take a look. If I do the combo box, there's nothing in it. If I click test, now I come back to the combo box and open it up. I have a series of states in here, and there's obviously some garbage data and empty and 11 up here. I think that's 11. Yes. Let's take a look at the code behind this. So it's using standard ADO.NET. I'm making a SQL connection. I apply a connection string. I tell it where my SQL server is located at. I tell it then what the name of the catalog is, what the user ID is, and I also tell it what the password is at this point. Now down below, I apply that connection string to my connection object that I created. I then open up that connection. Then down below, I have a select statement in here that I create where I'm selecting the distinct states from a zip codes table. I'm ordering it by state, and I'm applying that to the CN connection. Then when you execute that reader, I move all of that state data, all the results of the select statement into this SQL data reader right here. And then row by row from that data reader, I read a state and then I add it into that combo box that we have above. What are the possibilities of errors that occur in here? Well, there's several different points where errors might occur. First of all, this connection.open goes back out and it opens this connection. So there's always a possibility that this connection right here has an error in it somewhere. So let's take a look at an example of that. We saw it work. Let's put a 3.4 in here for a different IP address, and let's run it. Now the errors may take as long as 30 seconds to occur. I'll try to shorten that down within the lecture for you. Okay, so click the test. Okay, after a moment, after about 30 seconds, I get my error. Notice that the error that came up was a SQL exception error. And it says a network-related instance or specific error occurred while establishing a connection to SQL Server. The server was not found. So it waited to try to find server 134.39.173.34 and couldn't find it, and it generated this error message right here. So what you would want to do in most cases is to note that error message. I would probably take that, copy it out, and throw it into a notepad someplace on my computer. And I would take note, IP bad, and the error message that I get out of that is that error message. Now let's jump back again. I'm going to move that out of the way, and let's correct that. Give it a correct IP address, but this time let's force an error with the wrong database. So let's just put an X at the end of the database that we're using here. Let's go ahead and run it. Let's click test and see how long it takes to come back this time. Pretty quick, and right off the bat it tells me cannot open database demo guest requested by the user. The login failed, and that's because that database didn't exist. So let's copy that message. I'm going to move back over to my notes. Put a Control V in there, and above that, describe it and say bad database. Jump down below here. Let's stop this guy. Let's correct the database name and give it an incorrect login name, someone who doesn't exist. Let's rerun it again and take a look at this error message that pops open. Boom. It says login failed for demo guest. That person didn't exist, so let's copy that error out so we know what it's doing. And look, all of these are coming back as SQL exception errors. So that's the specific error that we're going to want to look for to capture. So let's jump back. Let me take a look at my notepad again. Let's put in bad login. Record that guy. And let's continue on here. So let's correct the login. And now let's go a step further. That's the line that was generating those errors. Let's change some of our statements down below here. Right now I'm selecting distinct state. Let's try to grab a column that doesn't exist, state X here, and see where the error is generated and what the error says. Test. Right off the bat, it says invalid column name state X. Let's grab that statement. Let's copy it. Let's jump down below on our notepad. And this is a different area because notice the error now was being generated when it tried to execute the reader or execute the command. So let's keep those separated. Control V, invalid column name state X. Let's return back. Let's correct that guy. So I'm just looking for all the potential different errors that I can force to happen. And let's try a table that doesn't exist. Test it. Tells me the table didn't exist. So let's copy that guy. Let's go back to our notepad. And right here, I'm just going to put both of those as bad select statements in here. And that probably should do it for right now. Let's leave it at that. And let's continue up here and let's make some corrections now. So I need to try to catch any error that occurs at that spot, and I need to catch any errors that occurs when that SQL statement is executed on the server. So the very first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to apply my try statement, but it's going to be a little bit different now. I'm going to look for a specific error. Okay. Now it's looking for standard exception. I'm going to put in my SQL exception. SQL exception error. And how do I know it was a SQL exception error? Because remember, we generated, we ran the statement, we forced the error to occur, and at the very top it told me it was a SQL exception. Now what I can do inside of here is I can determine what kind of error it is. Really, if I just want to put a generic error message together, I could do something like and this is probably one that would force my program to stop, to terminate. So let's make that happen here. Let's do a message, and we're just going to put a generic one in here right now. It's going to only stop here on a SQL exception, but we're not going to look to see what kind of exception it was initially. So my message box is going to say something like, let's try that again, message box.show something happened connecting to the server. We know any of those error messages that came up, it was specific to that right there, and we can prove that that's going to happen. We'll catch that error. Let's just put any error message back in here at all. Let's put a 5 in here. Now it's going to continue to generate some errors because remember, once it generates that error, I haven't told it to return or stop yet. So it's going to then try to open the error and open the connection that doesn't exist. But we want to get this first error message to pop up. So let's try that. Test. Oh, it made it past that first connection because I didn't make an error here. Let's force an error. Oops. Got to have an error to occur for the error to trap. Try it again. Test. And it's going to take a moment. We made it past that error above, and why did it not catch the error right here? Should have popped open an error message and said it couldn't get to that server. Let's find out why that was. Let's put a stop here and step through it. It should have caught it there. So let's go ahead and start it again. Oh, why did it not error out? It's because I didn't put the open statement in there. Duh. Let's correct that. It was trying nothing. We wanted to try the open statement. Folks probably saw that occur and were just yelling that out loud, and I just didn't hear you. So let's try that again. Test. So the error message popped back open. I've got something happen connecting to the server. Now if I click OK, it's going to want to jump down and continue working and give me some additional errors within the program. But I harnessed that specific error. I didn't look to see what kind it was, but I did harness any error that would occur within that connection string. It shouldn't matter what I do up here. And if that is enough, then you could stop right there. But let me show you some additional things that I could do. So you see how I jump below. First thing I want to do up here is I might want to add in a message, an EX at the end of that. That's going to give me access to all the error information that comes back up. Let's again take a look at that error, and this time we're going to do an EX.message. See what the message is. Rerun it, execute it. So our message box is returned with the system error message that occurred on the inside of it. Again, this is not a user-friendly error message, so it depends upon who your clients are, what kind of error message you want to give back. So what I would suggest that we do is, let's do something like this. I can go back in, and the reason that I maintained these messages right here is to be able to go back in and tell the user exactly what the error was, and I can look for a specific term that exists inside of here. So for example, if the IP is bad, and generally folks, if your connection string is bad, it's not the user's fault unless they have the ability to add a connection string, but nonetheless we're going to address it anyway. So let's take a look at what we have here. How about could not open a connection? That's a pretty good one that tells me the SQL server is not found. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, and down below inside my code I'm going to look for that specific error in my catch. So I'm going to come back here and stop the app from running. That always helps. I'm going to come in and I'm going to say look at ex.message. Okay, if ex.message.indexOf, if it has inside of it that statement that I just copied into memory, let's try putting quotes in here, and I paste that in here. If it finds it, it's a zero-based index. It's going to look at the very beginning. If it doesn't find it anywhere within the EX message, that string could not open a connection, then it's going to return back a -1. So as long as it doesn't equal a -1, it's somewhere in that statement. I want to modify that message. So I'm going to say if it's greater than a -1, which means it's been returned back someplace, then I want to come back in and tell them there is there's a server error. Contact admin. There we go. Now, as long as I'm at it, I should mention too that in my commercial apps or in my client apps, not only do I put a message back to the screen, but I also will include a statement in here that will text me who was logged. So I actually have my error message text me what program was being run that generated an error, what line number that program generated the error off of. I have it come back in and tell me who the user was that generated the error, and again what the error message was specifically. And I can contact my clients and tell them I see that they had an error occur about the same moment they realized that they had that error. And that's a really great customer service feature. Here's what's happening right here. If the message is greater than 1, that means it found it, and let's just be consistent here. Let me put my brackets in here, which are optional when there's a single statement like this. Okay? But if it's that error message, then I put that up. And I could continue on else if the message has in it any of these other elements. For example, bad database. I could look and say, does it say cannot open a database? If it is, I can give them a message saying the database doesn't exist or it's a bad database. Or more likely, which would be better, is login failed. That's the one that would probably be the most important one to the typical user. So I can identify the specific error message back to that specific user. I want to close that out. So that's a pretty good example right there. I also want to put another TryCatch around this statement right here. And I'd want to make that one a SQL exception as well. Capture the message that comes back with it. This is what's going to be tested right here. Put that inside the try region, and now I need to decide what happens if the select statement doesn't work. Maybe there's user input in here that they put in, doesn't work, whatever. There could be a variety of different reasons or different ways that I could address this. And of course, why is my SQL exception not working here? It's because, let's copy this, come back down here, paste it in, there we go. And again, I could do whatever I want at this point right here. There's another situation that might come up. Normally, exceptions are system handled. Means that wrong data is there, it doesn't meet the format, can't find a server, but occasionally you're going to decide what an error is. Say, for example, if I went back in and I told it to read records, I have the ability now to throw an exception, to cause an error to occur. Okay, I've got a little bit of housekeeping I've got to do, a couple of errors that I have in that previous example I need to correct, and it was similar to the above error that we did before. You'll notice right here that I'm creating the data reader, I'm instantiating it, and I'm executing it. The problem is the moment that this bracket hits, that data reader is going to be lost because since it's instantiated within these brackets, scope says it dies at that bracket. So what I need to do is I need to pull that instantiation there, copy it, put it up above the data reader like I did right here, and then I can come back in now and delete this guy out, and I should be good to go. That should work. Now, occasionally you're going to have an issue that comes up where you want to generate a custom error. Not a normal error that might come up, but you might have a situation where you say this combination of user input is incorrect, even though it doesn't naturally generate an error. For example, let's decide here that if no records are returned back, I expect that I have to get states back. But let's say if no records are returned back, I want to generate an error. I want to force an error to occur. So notice what I'm doing right now is I'm executing a reader right here. And now I can generate an if that reader, let's try that again, if that reader.zip has rows. Now I'm going to check for the opposite, if it doesn't have rows. So if not reader.zip has rows, it's going to get to this chunk of code if it doesn't have rows. I want to now throw an error. Notice down below here it's automatically giving me a throw which generates an error. I'm going to throw now a new, and I'm going to throw a standard exception. Something like that. That will cause an automatic error to occur, but I'm looking for a generic exception, which means now that I'm going to come down below here, I'm going to add in that generic exception. So I've got SQL exception, and now I've got a generic exception, and I could put something in here like message box dot show missing rows, something to that extent. And then of course I probably would want to return as well here to get out of this particular statement. So let's review again what's happening. I've got a try in here, and so it's going to try this chunk of code. If that chunk of code generates an error on its own, it's going to run this SQL exception error right here. And that's the least likely error that it's going to hit. If that doesn't generate an error, then it's going to come down here and it's going to run this code. And if that reader, when it ran, had no rows, if there's no rows at all, it's going to generate a generic exception error. It's going to cause an error to occur. When it causes that error to occur, it's going to jump down below here and it's going to execute this standard exception. These exceptions match right here. It's going to execute this one. Notice I've got this EX here. I don't need that if I'm not going to use EX below, because this is going to give me a warning every time I compile. So I can go ahead and take that out if I want to. So if I run this guy right now, I think he should work, and then I'll make him not work here. So going ahead and compiling him. Let's test it. Oh, you know what? I think I have an error up above that I didn't correct. Let's make sure everything here is correct. I think so. Let's go put a stop here because I want to make sure I've got all my, oh, and I see where my error is right off the bat. 3.5, I never corrected that. It should have happened a lot quicker. And by the way, folks, I should stop and mention a little bit. There, you'll notice, and I try to cut it out of my lectures a bit, that when your connection string has an error in it, it may take 15, 20, 30 seconds for it to give an error message back. If you want to adjust that error message, you can come to the end of this line here, put a semicolon in, and do a timeout. And within the timeout, you can put the number of seconds that you'd like the timeout to occur. You can shorten it down if you want to. Let's go ahead and leave it like it is for now. It should work. Let's go ahead and run it. Click test. And it's generated an exception error. I don't know what that error is. Oh, invalid object name table zip code, which is telling me then that I must have come back in here. I'm going to what table here? I'm going to demo guest. I'm looking for demo guest, and I'm looking for Spokane, and it's looking for a table called table zip code. Let me pause for a second and make sure I've got that correct table here. So what I've done, folks, is I'm going back out to my database, and I want to make sure that demo guest is set up correctly. There's demo guest, there's my tables, and it's table zip codes, and there's my columns in it. Let's go back to my demo here. That's this demo right here. And make sure I've got everything correctly. 134.39.173.35. My initial catalog is demo guest, and the password. Let's double check that. And table zip codes, demo guest, and that does appear to be correct. Demo guest. No, it's demo guest. That's correct. Demo guest login. Let's run it and see what happens here. I'm going to put a pause over here at the open just to see where we end up. Okay, here's our application. Test it. And let's step through it and see if this is working. It did work. Okay, so now we're trying to do a select statement here. This is probably where the error came from. Table zip code, I believe that's table zip codes. Let's just double check that. Table zip codes, there's my error right there. That should be table zip codes. So let's stop it. Let's put my S on table zip codes, and if I want to make sure everything's working correctly, I could grab that, copy it, jump back over to SQL, do a new query, make sure that I'm in demo guest, oops, try that again, demo guest, paste that select statement in, and execute it, and it works. Over here, everything should be in pretty good shape right now. Let's run it. Right now in here, I'm not catching the SQL error exception, so I need to put something in here. This throw is going to generate just a generic error back to the screen as though there wasn't even an error handler in here. So I could put something in here like this. Copy, paste it, and say some kind of a SQL error. How do I know that it's a SQL error? Because that's a SQL exception that was generated. It's only going to catch it if it's a SQL exception. And again, this EX is being not used, so let's just go ahead and take that EX out, and let's rerun it. And correct that message here. There we go. Rerun it. I'm hoping that it works. Test it. Got my open. Let's take that out and continue the running part of it. And I have all the drops in here. Now, let's come back in here and let's make it so no records are returned back. Let's do this. Let's say where state equals XX. Right here. There is no state equal XX, so when it runs that statement, I would expect it to return back 0 records. So it's going to execute it. Here, when it comes back and has rows, it's not going to have rows, so I'd expect it to throw an error. The moment it throws an error, it's going to run the standard exception, which is this guy down here that says missing rows. Let's see how that's going to work. So run a test, missing rows. So you see, this is an example of a custom error message. So not just system errors that come up, you can generate whatever error messages that you want and harness those, and you can decide from a user standpoint what an error is and what an error isn't without having to physically have an error occur. So hopefully, folks, this section has made sense. I would expect from this point forward within the class that you use TryCatches and try to avoid any error that can come up. And there is a lot of different ways. Again, you don't have to always use a TryCatch. Earlier, we did a TryCatch around a parse statement. That's just one technique for determining whether or not the user put the correct information in or not.